Want to know what Europe does for you? Welcome to European Parliamentary Research Service podcast on promoting equality between men and women.
We've come a long way in Europe when it's about ensuring equality between women and men, but the situation remains uneven across EU countries.
And in recent times, progress towards this much cherished goal has slowed, even regressed in some areas. Want to know what the EU is doing to foster gender equality? Stay with us.
Let me start by giving you some EU figures. Only 1 in 4 senior managers are female, only 29% of seats in national parliaments are occupied by women, and women in the EU earned on average 16% less than men in 2017.
This gives you an idea of how things stand concerning gender equality. In brief, better than a few decades ago, but clearly insufficient. For equality between men and women is a fundamental value of the European Union and one that has been enshrined in the treaties from the very beginning, as the Treaty of Rome included a provision on equal pay.
Over the past 60 years, societal changes and EU policy efforts have established a trend towards more gender equality, but progress has been slow and the situation varies greatly depending on which country you look at.
So whilst most score relatively well on health and education, things are somewhat worse when we turn to employment, access to economic and financial resources, or leadership, which is the area where most progress has been made, but where the gender gap remains widest.
And in some EU member states, the gap is even increasing in areas such as unpaid care and domestic work, as cuts to public services and other austerity measures have undermined progress towards women's integration into the labour market and a more equal division of care responsibilities.
Women, young people and migrants are also the groups most likely to be engaged in increasingly common, non-standard forms of work, such as on-call work or temporary jobs, which are more insecure and are linked with lower pay, training and maternity benefits.
According to EU data, almost half of women with low qualifications work in a precarious job, compared to just over a quarter of men with the same level of education, which translates into a higher risk of poverty and social exclusion.
And then there's the issue of violence against women, with 1 in 3 women in Europe having experienced physical and/or sexual violence since the age of 15. So the problem remains a very serious one, especially with new forms of online violence adding to the mix.
In some member states, national equality bodies have warned that levels of inequality, intolerance and discrimination are on the rise amidst a populist discourse that is often hostile to fundamental values. So what role is the EU playing to defend equality between women and men and women's rights as core values? Stay with us.
A large majority of Europeans think that promoting gender equality is good for society, for the economy and for them personally, and a growing share of citizens would like the EU to do more in this area.
And they're right, as there is ample evidence of the benefits of gender equality and its potential to improve the lives of people, both women and men, as well as societies and the economy as a whole.
Actually, it's estimated that the gender pay gap will cost the EU €240 billion in reduced GDP by 2030, while other research suggests that closing gender gaps in areas such as education, jobs and wages will create more jobs for both sexes, help tackle long-standing issues such as occupational segregation and low productivity, and increase GDP per capita, and that's the direction the EU wants to move in.
To get there, the EU has developed extensive legislation on gender equality since the 1970s, primarily in the field of employment, covering equal pay, social security, working conditions and harassment, self-employment, and rights to maternity and parental leave.
EU laws also guarantee equal access to goods and services and protection for victims of trafficking and crime. And next to its own laws, the EU and its member states have committed to gender equality under international human rights treaties and agreements, some of which go even further than EU standards.
During the current legislative term, as part of a broader gender equality programme, the EU institutions have been working on proposals for new EU actions to close the gender pay gap and to improve work-life balance by modernising the existing EU law on parental leave and establishing EU-wide rights to carers and paternity leave, as well as flexible working arrangements for parents and carers.
The European Parliament has consistently taken a strong, proactive stance on advancing gender equality, pushing the Commission to ensure that Member States deliver on EU commitments in this field, and it has expressed disappointment that EU action has fallen short of Parliament's calls in areas such as combating violence against women, equal pay and work-life balance, amongst others.
The Parliament also believes EU funding should be used much more proactively to achieve gender equality goals, and has called for gender budgeting to be applied in all EU budget lines and in all future EU funding programmes.
MEPs have also drawn attention to action that could be taken on emerging issues, for instance, to respond to the specific needs of women and girls in asylum procedures, to tackle new forms of gender-based violence such as cyberstalking, and to adopt a more gender-sensitive approach in climate change and in trade policy.
So what more is there for the EU to do in the future? Stay with us.
Well, there are several ways in which the EU could get more involved in this issue. For example, ensuring better implementation and enforcement of existing laws, and it could also modernise some of these laws or fill gaps in protection and address emerging issues.
The EU could also enhance data collection and monitoring, contribute to awareness raising, and better support national equality bodies and grassroots initiatives.
And there are still areas in which gender inequality occurs that are not covered by specific EU laws. For example, violence against women, education and protection against discrimination. So why hasn't it happened yet?
Well, one difficulty is that the treaties do not give the EU a straightforward legal basis for addressing some issues, such as violence against women. However, the biggest obstacle in most files has been member states' reluctance to let the EU legislate on certain issues.
In the next EU budget for the 2021 to 2027 period, funding for gender equality will continue to be spread across several funds, such as the Justice, Rights and Values Fund, the European Social Fund Plus and the Horizon Europe Research Programme, although some of these funding programmes have a bigger gender equality dimension than others.
In the light of current societal challenges such as an ageing population, the shrinking of the working age population, and the need to break down persistent barriers to women's participation, the EU has reaffirmed its commitment to gender equality.
But it will require strong political will at all levels to tackle issues across a broad spectrum of policies, together with the provision of the necessary institutions, tools and resources to put that resolve into action.
What's clear is that combating violence against women and promoting equality between women and men in its broadest sense will remain major challenges in the years to come.
You're listening to the European Parliamentary Research Service podcast.